The rain made the city look like a smudged painting from the 50th floor. Lawrence Thorne watched it streak the glass, feeling nothing about the view he paid so much for. Below, people were tiny, slow-moving ants. He preferred that perspective. It was clean, uncomplicated. His assistant, a young man in a suit that was too sharp to be comfortable, cleared his throat. "The car is ready, sir." "For Oak Ridge." Lawrence didn't turn. Oak Ridge. He said the word like it was a flavor he'd decided he didn't like. "The children's home, sir." Potential adoption visit. "The photographer from the Chronicle will meet us there at 10. "Ah, yes." The performance. A necessary one, his public relations team had insisted. The headlines had been getting a bit too spicy lately. Thorne cuts 500 jobs at Milltown plant. Thorne tech sued over privacy issues. He needed something to soften the edges. A splash of human warmth. A story about a lonely millionaire finding purpose in fatherhood was just the thing. It didn't have to be real. It just had to look real for an afternoon. The orphanage was a long, low brick building that had seen better decades. It sat under a sky the color of old dishwater. The air inside smelled of industrial cleaner and slightly old potatoes. Lawrence smiled a thin, practiced smile for the photographer. A woman with a lens so big it looked like a weapon. He was greeted by Mrs. Albright, the director. She had a kind face, but her eyes were the tired eyes of someone who had asked for too many donations and received too few. "Mr. Thorne, we're so honored by your interest," she said, her voice a soft, worn-out melody. "The honor is mine," Lawrence replied, the lie smooth as silk. He let his gaze sweep over the common room. A few children played with worn-out toys. Others just watched the large, strange man in the expensive coat. He saw the calculation in some of their older eyes. They knew a visitor could mean a treat, a chance, or just another disappointment. The tour was a slow march through cheerful desperation. Bright, peeling murals of cartoon animals on dull walls. A donation check, presented with a flash of the camera, was accepted with genuine gratitude that made Lawrence's stomach tighten just a little. He shook small, sticky hands. He asked empty questions. "Do you like school? What's your favorite color?" The children gave shy, rehearsed answers. The whole thing was a ballet of mutual awkwardness. And Lawrence was counting the minutes until he could leave. "And this is our sunroom," Mrs. Albright said, leading him into a room at the back of the building. It was a grand name for a space with a few cracked vinyl chairs and windows that needed washing. The November light was weak and gray, and there, in the corner, was a girl. She was sitting perfectly still on a wooden stool beside an old, upright piano. The piano was a battleship of dark wood, scuffed and dusty. One of its front legs was slightly shorter, making it list to the side. The girl looked to be about 11 or 12. She had plain brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail. She wasn't pretty in a way that would grab a headline, nor was she pitifully frail. She was just there, quiet. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking out the window. But Lawrence had the strange feeling she wasn't really seeing the rusty, swing set outside. Something about her stillness annoyed him. It was a contrast to the performative energy of the morning. While everyone else was trying to impress, to get noticed, to get a photo, she was simply existing. It felt like a quiet judgment. Mrs. Albright followed his gaze. "Oh, that's her. She's a very quiet one. She spends a lot of time in here. She likes the piano, I think, though I've never really heard her play it properly." The photographer was adjusting her settings, looking for a good shot of Lawrence connecting. He felt a sudden, sharp need to be done with it all. The charity, the pretending, the faint smell of boiled cabbage in the air. He wanted to be back in his quiet, clean tower where things made sense. He nodded toward the girl. his voice taking on a tone he used in boardrooms to end discussions he found trivial. It was loud, clear, and carried an edge of sarcasm that Mrs. Albright would be too polite to acknowledge. "That one?" he said, a faint, dismissive smile on his lips. He waved a hand slightly, as if brushing away a fly. "Well," he continued, the challenge hanging in the air, a joke only he was in on, "if she can play the piano, I'll adopt her." He let the words hang. It was the perfect, cynical exit line. An impossible condition. It meant, this is silly. Let's wrap this up. He expected the girl to blush, to look down, to burst into tears at the impossible task. He expected Mrs. Albright to give an uncomfortable laugh and steer him toward the door. The photographer would get a shot of him looking vaguely benevolent, and they could all go home. But the girl moved. She turned her head from the window and looked right at him. Not at his shiny shoes or his expensive watch, but directly into his eyes. Her gaze was neither fearful nor hopeful. It was just clear, as if she was reading the fine print on his soul. Then, without a word, she slid off the stool. The legs scraped softly on the linoleum floor. She walked the 2 steps to the piano bench, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't look at the keys. She didn't take a deep, dramatic breath. She simply sat down, adjusted the bench slightly, and placed her small, pale hands on the yellowed keys. Lawrence's smirk froze. The photographer lowered her camera, confused. Mrs. Albright clasped her hands together, a look of mild panic on her face. The only sound was the distant shout of a child from another room, and then the girl began to play. The first sound wasn't a melody. It was a single low note that hung in the dusty air of the sunroom like a heavy drop of water waiting to fall. Then another, higher, a lonely echo of the first. The girl's fingers, which had seemed so small and still, now moved with a strange, knowing grace over the chipped ivory keys. Lawrence stood rooted to the spot, his prepared expression of bored tolerance slowly dissolving. This wasn't chopsticks. This wasn't some halting scale learned for a school recital. The notes began to weave together, slowly at first, like someone gathering threads in the dark. They formed a progression that was minor and somber, but not ugly. It was the musical equivalent of a gray, quiet dawn. The photographer forgot her camera entirely. Letting it hang from its strap, Mrs. Albright's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with something more than surprise. It was recognition, as if she was hearing a secret she'd always known was there, but had never been told. The girl played on. Her eyes were half closed, not looking at the keys or at the millionaire who had challenged her. She was somewhere else. The music began to build, not in volume, but in depth. A melody emerged. It was a wandering, questioning tune. It sounded like footsteps in an empty hallway, like the slow turn of a page in a book no one else was reading. It was profoundly, achingly lonely. Lawrence felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He was a man who heard music in expensive restaurants and at charity galas polished, perfect, and utterly meaningless. This was different. This wasn't played for him. It wasn't played for anyone. It was simply being released. Each note was a truth. The melody dipped and swelled. A cascade of higher notes sounded like raindrops on a window pane, a fleeting, pretty pattern that dissolved into a lower, rumbling chord of longing. Then, for a few bars, the music changed. It became lighter, sweeter, a fleeting memory of warmth, a smile that existed only in sound. Lawrence could almost see it, a fragment of a lullaby, a safe hand on a small forehead, a burst of sunlight in a room long gone. The girl's face softened, just for a second, and then it was torn away. A dissonant clash of keys, sharp and sudden like a door slamming shut. The sweet melody shattered, falling into a deeper, more complicated darkness. This was the heart of it. This was grief. Not the loud, screaming kind, but the quiet kind that gets folded into your clothes and lives in the back of your throat. It was the sound of waiting for a visit that never comes. The sound of watching other children leave and pretending you don't mind. It was the hollow space where a family should be. Lawrence's breath caught. He hadn't moved an inch. The world outside, the rusted swing set, the gray sky, the photographer's nervous shift had all blurred into nothing. There was only this room, this broken-down piano, and this child speaking a language he didn't know he could understand. He was a man who built empires out of code and contracts. He solved problems with logic and money. Emotion was a variable to be controlled, a weakness to be managed. But this was a raw, unedited stream of feeling. There was no filter, no spin, no strategy. It was honesty so brutal and beautiful, it was almost unbearable. He thought of his own penthouse, so silent you could hear the hum of the refrigerator. He thought of his conversations, all transactions and negotiations. He thought of the last time he had cried, and he couldn't remember. This girl, with her worn-out sneakers and simple ponytail, was showing him a universe of feeling he had spent a lifetime and a fortune walling off. The music began to slow. The storm of grief passed, leaving a landscape of quiet acceptance. The notes became sparse again, simple. A single phrase repeated, a little softer each time, like a goodbye whispered down a long corridor. It wasn't happy. It wasn't resolved. But it was enduring. It was the sound of a small, resilient heart that had learned to beat steadily in an empty room. Her hands lifted, and the final note faded, not with a grand ring, but with a soft sigh from the old piano's strings. The silence that followed was thicker and heavier than before. It wasn't empty. It was full of the echo of everything she had just said. The girl opened her eyes fully. She turned her head on her slender neck and looked back at Lawrence. There was no triumph in her face. No plea. No. Was that good enough? She had simply done the thing he had asked for. She had played the piano. Her expression was calm, clear, waiting. She had met his impossible condition with a truth he had never expected. The spell broke. Mrs. Albright let out a small, shaky breath, as if she'd been holding it for the whole song. The photographer blinked, suddenly remembering her job, and fumbled with her camera, unsure if she should take a picture now. The moment felt too private, too sacred for a flash. Lawrence realized his mouth was slightly dry. The cynical, dismissive words he had spoken just minutes before now hung in the air between them, transformed. They were no longer a joke. They were a promise. He had built his life on the integrity of his word in business deals. Now his careless, sarcastic word had been answered with the most authentic thing he had ever witnessed. He tried to find his voice, to say something, anything. A compliment? A question? But all the smooth, easy phrases he usually had at his command were gone. He felt stripped bare, as if the music had shone a light on the dusty, empty corners of his own soul. He just stared at the girl, and she stared back, unblinking. In her quiet gaze, he saw no calculation, no scheme. He saw only the echo of the music, a deep loneliness, a strength, and a quiet, unwavering honesty. Finally, he managed to move. It was just a small shift of his weight, but it felt huge. He cleared his throat, and the sound was too loud in the quiet room. "Well," he said, and his voice came out rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. It wasn't the polished boardroom tone. It was just a man's voice, slightly stunned. He had nothing else to say. The challenge had been met, and the game was over. But as he looked from the girl's calm face to the old, scarred piano, he knew with a cold, sinking certainty that everything had just begun. And for the first time in a very long time, Lawrence Thorne, The man who had all the answers had no idea what to do next. The silence in the limousine was a physical thing. It pressed against Lawrence's eardrums, thick and heavy, unlike the clean, empty quiet of his penthouse. He could still hear the music. It echoed in the space behind his eyes, a ghost melody threading through the sound of the tires on wet asphalt. His assistant, sensing the storm, had been silent the whole ride. Now, as they glided through the city gates, he ventured a careful, "The Chronicle will have the photos by 5. The PR team suggests a caption focusing on your emotional connection to the community. Should I approve it?" Lawrence didn't answer. He was staring out the window, but he wasn't seeing the gleaming storefronts. He was seeing a pair of small, calm hands on yellowed piano keys. He was hearing the sound of a door slamming shut in a minor key. "Sir?" "Tell them to wait," Lawrence said, his voice flat. "For?" "How long, sir?" "Indefinitely." Back in his apartment, the world was wrong. The angular furniture, the abstract art, the stunning, silent view, it all felt like a stage set. A beautifully constructed lie. The girl's music had been a truth, and it had made his entire existence feel fake. He poured a drink, the ice clinking too loudly in the glass. He tried to focus on a financial report, but the numbers swam on the page. Every quiet moment was filled with that haunting, questioning melody. It was the honesty that haunted him. In his world, nothing was ever fully honest. Deals had hidden clauses. Smiles had agendas. Words were tools. That girl, with her plain ponytail and worn shoes, had communicated more raw truth in 2 minutes than he had in 20 years. And he had treated it as a joke. 3 days later, he went back. No limousine, no assistant, no photographer. He drove himself in a car he rarely used, wearing a simple coat. The sky was the same dishwater gray. Mrs. Albright was surprised to see him. Her tired eyes flickered with cautious hope, then confusion when she saw he was alone. "Mr. Thorne, we weren't expecting." "I know," he said, cutting off the pleasantries. "Is she here?" "The girl. From the sunroom. She's usually there after her lessons," Mrs. Albright said slowly. "Would you like to see her?" He found her in the same spot. Not at the piano this time, but on the stool, a book open on her lap. She looked up as he entered. There was no shock, no smile. Just that same clear, waiting look. "Hello," Lawrence said. The word felt stiff. She nodded once. "Hello. You play?" "Very well, thank you." He gestured to the piano. "Did your parents?" "They played," she said simply. Her voice was soft, but not shy. "This was theirs. It came here with me." "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in a long time, the words weren't just polite noise. He meant them. She looked down at her book, then back at him. "You said you would adopt me. If I played." The statement was so direct, so devoid of guile, it winded him. She wasn't begging. She wasn't leveraging. She was just stating the terms of the contract as she understood them. He, the master of deals, was being held to his word by a child. I know I did," he managed. "I played," she said. There was no accusation in it. Just fact. "I fulfilled my part." He had built an empire on the principle that a spoken promise was binding. Now, his own cynical throwaway line had become the most important contract of his life. He spent the next hour talking with Mrs. Albright in her cramped, paper-cluttered office. He learned the facts. The parents, both musicians, died in a road accident when the girl was 7. No other family. She had arrived at Oak Ridge with a small suitcase and the old piano. She was quiet, did well enough in school, caused no trouble. She had no close friends. The piano was her friend. "She speaks to it," Mrs. Albright said, stirring her tea. Or, well, it speaks for her. I've heard little things over the years, a few notes here and there, but what she played for you, I've never heard anything like that from her. It was like she showed you something. She did, Lawrence said quietly. She asked me this morning, Mrs. Albright continued, her gaze steady on him. She asked if the man who made the promise was a man who kept his promises. I didn't know what to tell her. The words were a knife. Lawrence saw himself as others saw him. Powerful, decisive, a man of his word in business. But was he? To a child? In this? He left the orphanage feeling more unsettled than when he'd arrived. The problem wouldn't be solved by writing a check. He had, with his own big mouth, created a human problem. A promise problem. That night, in his sterile kitchen, he made a decision. It was a logistical decision, one he could understand. He would fulfill the letter of the promise. He would adopt her. It was clean. It solved the ethical dilemma. He would provide a home, the best schools, everything material she could ever want. It would be a transaction. She had provided a service meeting his challenge, and he would provide payment, a life of luxury. It was a deal. He was good at deals. He called his lawyer first thing in the morning. The man was predictably baffled. You want to? Fast-track a private adoption? Based on a single visit? Based on a verbal agreement, Lawrence corrected, his business voice firmly back in place. Draw up the papers. Make the donations necessary to smooth the path. I want it done correctly, but quickly. The machinery of his wealth and influence whirred to life. Social workers were consulted. Home studies were arranged. His penthouse was, of course, deemed exceptionally suitable. Checks were written to Oak Ridge, ensuring their enthusiastic cooperation. He was solving it. He visited her once a week during the process. Their conversations were stilted, happening in the sunroom or on a bench in the bleak garden. They tell me I will live in a tall building, she said one day. Double quotes, yes. You'll have your own room. With a view. Is there a piano? There will be. A better one. She looked at the old, listing upright, her fingers brushing the wood. This one knows my songs. The new one will learn them, he said, feeling foolish as he said it. The day she arrived at his building was surreal. She carried the same small suitcase. A social worker bustled around, making cheerful, meaningless chatter. The girls stood in the vast, open-plan living room, dwarfed by the ceiling. She didn't run to the floor-to-ceiling windows to see the view. She just stood still, taking it in. The silence, the space, the cold perfection of it all. Lawrence showed her to her room. It had been decorated by professional soft colors, expensive bedding, shelves empty and waiting for books. In the corner, covered with a cloth, was the grand piano, a beautiful, black, gleaming Steinway. He pulled the cloth off with a flourish. For you, he said. She walked over to it. She didn't gasp. She didn't immediately sit down. She just looked at it, her reflection, a small, serious smudge in the polished black lacquer. After a long moment, she sat. She lifted the fallboard, revealing the perfect virgin keys. She touched one. A pure, rich, perfect note bloomed in the room, so different from the dusty sigh of the old piano at Oak Ridge. She placed her hands in position. Lawrence held his breath, waiting for the honesty, for the storm, for the truth. She began to play. It was a simple, classical piece. A Bach minuet. It was technically correct, perfectly in time, and utterly, completely empty. It was polite. It was a thank you note written in music. When she finished, she turned to him. It's a very nice piano, she said softly. Thank you. Lawrence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He had gotten what he wanted. A neat solution. A child in his home. A promise kept. But as he looked at her sitting stiffly on the bench of the magnificent piano, playing perfect, hollow notes, he realized with a jolt that he hadn't adopted the girl who played for him in the sunroom. That girl was gone. He had, with his money and his deals and his perfect piano, managed to silence the very thing that had drawn him to her in the first place. He had won the transaction, and in doing so, he had lost the music. The days settled into a new, silent pattern. The girl lived in his home, but she was like a quiet ghost in a museum. She went to the new, expensive school he'd arranged. She did her homework at the vast marble kitchen island. She ate the meals his housekeeper prepared, picking at the food with polite disinterest. And she played the grand piano dot every evening, like clockwork. She would sit at the beautiful Steinway and practice. Scales arpeggiated with crystal clarity. Studies by Czerny, precise and emotionless. Moore Batch, perfectly measured. It was all flawless, and to Lawrence, it was like listening to a beautifully spoken language that meant absolutely nothing. The fire, the storm, the heartbreaking honesty of that first performance was locked away. The piano was no longer a voice. It was an appliance. She was using it the way another child might use a dishwasher. He tried to make conversation. It was like talking to a polite stranger. How was school? It was fine, thank you. Do you need anything? Books? Clothes? No, thank you. Everything is very nice. Her gratitude was a wall. Her fine and nice were bricks in that wall. She was performing the role of an adopted daughter in a millionaire's home, just as he had once performed the role of an interested philanthropist. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He found himself wandering near her closed bedroom door at night, listening for any sound. There was only silence. He missed the music he'd only heard once. He missed it with an ache that surprised him. He hadn't just brought a child into his home. He had brought in a mystery, and then promptly lost the key. One night, about 3 weeks in, the silence broke. He was in his study, staring at a complicated contract, his head throbbing. The deal was slipping through his fingers due to a rival's cunning move. He felt a familiar, cold anger rising, the anger of being outmaneuvered. In frustration, he brought his clenched fist down on the polished surface of his glass desk. Not a slam, but a hard, deliberate tap, 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 tap. A staccato rhythm of pure irritation. The sound echoed in the quiet room. He sighed, rubbing his temples. And then, from down the hall, through the partly open door of the living room, an answer came. It was a single chord from the grand piano. A rich, complex chord that wasn't from any of her practice books. It hung in the air for a second. Then, a playful, answering tap, tap, tap of high notes, mimicking the exact rhythm of his knuckles on the glass. Lawrence froze, his hand still on his forehead. He listened, his heart doing a strange little skip. He tapped on the glass again, slower this time. Tap, tap, tap. A moment's pause. Then, from the piano, a lower, thoughtful sound, like a question. Asterisk boom? Boom dash boom dot asterisk. He got up, moving quietly to the doorway of the living room. She was sitting at the piano in her pajamas, the room dark except for a single small lamp. She wasn't looking at him. Her fingers rested on the keys. He stepped in, leaning against the wall. He didn't know what to say. So, he went back to the only language they had just discovered. He hummed a short, low tune, the vague memory of some old song. She listened, her head tilted. Then, with one finger, she picked out the notes, finding the melody. She got it wrong in the middle, fumbling a note. He hummed it again, correcting it. She found the right note. Then she didn't just repeat it. She added a harmony beneath it with her other hand, a simple, warm third that transformed his absent-minded hum into something small and complete. A tiny piece of music, born in the dark between them. She looked at him then, for the first time in weeks, not with polite distance, but with a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. "It's late," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "The piece you were playing earlier. The study. You played it very well." She looked down at the keys. "It's just notes on a page," she murmured. "It doesn't mean anything." His breath caught. There it was. The truth slipping out. "The music you played at Oak Ridge meant something," he said quietly. She shrugged a small shrug, a gesture that seemed too old for her. "That was different. That piano knew my songs. This one, it's too perfect. It only knows how to be correct." He understood then. The old, listing upright was a friend. It had scars and dust and secrets. This glorious Steinway was a judge. It demanded perfection, and in trying to give it, she had locked her real self away. He pushed himself off the wall and walked over. He stood awkwardly beside the piano, looking at the vast expanse of black and white. "I don't know anything about music," he admitted. "I can't tell a study from a sonata. But I know what I heard that day. I've never heard anything like it." She was silent for a long time. Then, very slowly, she placed her hands on the keys, but not in the proper, practiced position. She let her fingers drift to the very low bass notes. She pressed a deep, rumbling cluster of sound, a sound like distant thunder or a giant waking up. It was ugly and beautiful at the same time. "That's the sound of the big front door at Oak Ridge closing at night," she whispered, almost to herself. Her right hand floated up and traced a light, tinkling, random pattern in the high notes. "That's the sound of the rain on the sunroom roof." Then, with both hands, she played a strong, rhythmic, marching pattern in the middle of the piano. "That's Mrs. Albright's shoes in the hallway." Lawrence sank into a nearby armchair, watching her. She wasn't playing a song. She was painting with sound. She played a short, sweet, lonely little phrase. "That's the yellow bird that used to visit the window. I called him Leo." The phrase repeated, then faded away. He realized, with a jolt, that this was how she saw the world. Not in pictures or words, but in sounds. Her memories were a library of noises. And she was finally, tentatively, letting him listen. He didn't speak. He just listened. He nodded when a sound seemed clear. He smiled a little when she played the silly, skittering sound of the orphanage cat running on polished floors. After a while, she stopped, her hands falling back into her lap. The room felt different, warmer. The piano was no longer a judge. It was starting to become a translator. "Tomorrow," Lawrence said, the idea forming as he spoke, "we'll go somewhere. You and me. No agenda." The next day was a Saturday. He didn't call the driver. They took his ordinary car. He drove them out of the city, to a big, sprawling park with a lake. They walked without talking much. He pointed out a crooked tree that looked like an old man bending over. She listened, and later, as they sat on a bench, she mimicked the shape of its branches with a twisting, groaning little melody on the small keyboard app he'd downloaded to his phone at her shy request. He bought 2 cheap ice creams from a cart. They ate them by the water. He got a dab of chocolate on his expensive coat. She, for the first time, gave a small, genuine smile, not a polite one, at his clumsy attempt to wipe it off. "It's messy," she said. "Life is messy," he replied. And he didn't try to clean it further. That night, back home, she didn't go straight to her practice pieces. She went to the piano and played the Crook Tree melody, fleshing it out. It wasn't the overwhelming emotional storm of her first performance. It was something new. It was a shared memory, translated into sound. It was a conversation. Lawrence sat in his armchair, a book unopened on his lap, and listened. He wasn't a father yet. She wasn't a daughter. They were two lonely people, one who had built a fortress of money, the other who had built a fortress of silence, and they were brick by brick, note by note, finding a way to make a bridge between them. The music wasn't perfect. Sometimes she hit a wrong note. Sometimes a phrase didn't work. But for the first time since she arrived, it was honest again. And for the first time in a very long time, Lawrence Thorne felt like he was in the presence of something real. The bridge they built was made of small things. A shared look over a burnt piece of toast. A silly sound made to describe the grumpy doorman. The crooked tree melody, which became their secret tune. A three-note greeting hummed in the hallway. The grand piano in the living room slowly lost its perfection. Sheet music was left open, sometimes with a pencil mark where she'd changed a note. A well-loved stuffed rabbit, brought from Oak Ridge, took up residence on the bench. Lawrence learned to listen in a new way, not just to her music, but to her silences. The tense quiet before a test at school was different from the peaceful quiet of her drawing. He started leaving his study door open. She started leaving her bedroom door ajar. The music was the heart of it, though. Evenings were no longer for flawless etudes. They were for sound paintings. The clatter of the city street became a frantic, jazzy rhythm. The sigh of the elevator was a long, sliding note. She played the feeling of the warm sun from the park visit and the frustrating knot of a difficult math problem. He would listen, and sometimes he would try to guess. That sounds like the photocopier at my office. She'd nod, a small smile touching her lips. He was learning her language. Then the walls shook. A business publication broke a story about Thorne Tech. It was filled with leaked emails, cold calculations about layoffs, private comments mocking environmental regulations. The narrative was brutal. Lawrence Thorne was not a tough businessman. He was a heartless machine. His rivals piled on. News channels ran segments. The stock price began to tumble, not sharply, but with a sickening steadiness. Lawrence retreated. The open study door closed. He spent hours on the phone, his voice a low, angry growl. The easy silences of the apartment were replaced with a thick, anxious tension. The girl watched him from a distance, her face pale and worried. She played the piano softly, timidly, the music shrinking back into itself. His PR team and lawyers devised a strategy. A press conference. He would look directly into the camera, express regret for any misunderstandings, highlight the company's contributions, and firmly deny any ill intent. It was a classic playbook. Contrition without admission. It was all about control. The morning of the press conference, he stood in his dressing room, tying his tie with sharp, jerky motions. He looked in the mirror and saw the old Lawrence Thorne, the fortress, the man of steel and calculations. The suit was his armor. He walked out into the living room, ready to leave. She was there, sitting on the bench, not playing, just waiting. She was wearing the simple green dress she'd worn on the day they met. "You're going to talk to the cameras," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I have to fix some things." "Are you going to tell the truth?" she asked. Her clear eyes were on him, just like in the sunroom. The question stopped him cold. His prepared speech flashed through his mind, the careful words, the strategic pauses. It was a performance. A complex, polished piece of music designed to sound good and say nothing. "It's complicated," he said, the businessman's automatic answer. She just looked at him. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. In her gaze, he heard the echo of her honest music and the memory of his own hollow, perfect notes on the glass desk. He thought of the difference between the flawless, empty batch and the messy, true sound of the crooked tree. He left for the conference center feeling unsettled. The room was packed. Lights glared. Microphones bristled like hostile creatures. He sat at the long table, his lawyers flanking him, a wall of solemn suits. He looked at the sea of expectant, skeptical faces. He saw the journalists ready to dissect every word. He saw his future hanging in the balance. The lead lawyer nudged the typed statement toward him. It began, "Over the past weeks, my company has been the subject of intense scrutiny." Lawrence looked down at the words. They were perfect. They were safe. They were a lie. They were the musical etude. Technically correct, emotionally void. He thought of the girl's question. Asterisk, are you going to tell the truth? Asterisk, he thought of the cold, calculating man in those emails. That had been him. The man who saw people as numbers. The man who had scoffed at an orphanage. That was a truth. But so was the man who sat in a dark room, listening to a child translate the world into sound. Who kept a stuffed rabbit on a piano bench. That was a truth, too. The prepared statement admitted neither. A strange calm descended on him. It wasn't the calm of control, but the calm of letting go. He pushed the paper away slowly. The lawyer stiffened. A murmur went through the crowd. He leaned toward the microphones. The lights felt hotter. "The emails you've read," he began, his voice quieter than they expected. It wasn't a podium voice. It was just a man's voice. "They're real. I wrote them. The person who wrote those." He saw the world as a spreadsheet. People were liabilities or assets. It was a very lonely way to see things. You could have heard a pin drop. His lead lawyer put a hand over his own eyes. "I was wrong," Lawrence continued, the words simple and heavy. "Not just legally or in public relations. I was wrong in my heart. I can't undo the choices I made then, but I am responsible for them, completely." He didn't offer excuses. He didn't spin. He outlined, in plain terms, what he would do. A full external review of the layoff decisions. A genuine investment in the environmental fixes, not just a fine. A personal donation of his next year's salary to a fund for displaced workers. They weren't grand, vague promises. They were specific, costly actions. The truth, he realized, was expensive. When he finished, the room erupted in shouted questions. He answered a few, sticking to his new simple language. No more jargon. No more deflection. "Yes, it was my fault. No, I don't have an excuse." Afterward, in the car, the world was a blur. His phone buzzed incessantly outraged board members, stunned PR people, a few congratulatory texts from people he respected. He ignored them all. He felt lighter and more terrified than he ever had in his life. He had traded his armor for honesty, and he had no idea if it would protect him or ruin him. When he entered the penthouse, it was quiet. He loosened his tie, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. He walked into the living room. She was there, at the piano. She had been waiting. She looked at him, her face serious, searching his. He managed a tired smile. "I told them about the crooked tree," he said, though he hadn't. Not literally. She understood. She patted the space on the bench beside her. He sat down. It was the first time he had sat beside her at the piano. The black and white keys stretched out in front of them, a landscape of possibilities. "Play something with me," she said quietly. "I don't know how," he said. "Just put one finger on a key. Any key." He hesitated, then slowly pressed down a single white key in the middle. A plain, clear note. She listened, her head tilted. Then she added a note beside it. A harmony. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was just two notes, together. Then, with her other hand, she played a slow, simple bass line underneath their two notes, giving it ground, giving it a heartbeat dot. It was clumsy. His finger slipped once, hitting a wrong note that made them both wince and then smile. They tried again. Another 2 notes from him. Another answer from her. They weren't performing for anyone. There was no audience. It was a conversation. A check-in. A shared, fragile creation in the wake of a storm. It was the opposite of the majestic, sorrowful solo she had played in the sunroom. That had been a cry from an island. This was the sound of building a raft together. Note by note, mistake by mistake. As they fumbled their way through a tiny, invented melody, Lawrence knew the outside world was still there. The headlines would be brutal tomorrow. The board might try to remove him. The money might bleed away. But in that moment, on the piano bench, making clumsy music with a child who had taught him how to hear, none of that mattered. He had finally stopped performing. And in the simple, honest space that was left, he wasn't a millionaire, and she wasn't an orphan. They were just 2 people, finding their tune, one true note at a time.